Thanks very much. And thanks very much for everyone for being here. As Kate said, I am neuroskeptic, not Eurosceptic, as it appears to have come out on here. That's, believe it or not my real name, and I've been blogging under a pseudonym for about nearly 8 years now, writing about neuroscience and science more broadly. But today I'm going to be talking about something which is often discussed in neuroscience, but actually applies to psychology and many other fields of science as well, which is the problem of p-hacking. To start this talk, just some headlines from the past few years, online and in published papers, around the issue that research findings, particularly in psychology, although as I say it applies elsewhere, are not replicating or are maybe false positives. There's been a lot of discussion about this, and the discussion I think has been growing and is continuing to grow. You hear things like the replication crisis, false positive psychology. A paper many people have heard of from about 10 years ago is called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. So there's a lot of concern about the reliability of findings, the reliability of really pretty much the very basis of what we're doing as scientists, which is whether or not our results are true or not. So I think this is a very serious concern. But what exactly is going on and why is this happening? Well, to answer this question, we need to go back 700 years and look at the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri, which was a famous poem in 3 books. The first one was called Inferno or Hell. The second one was Limbo, and the third one was Paradise. But the first one was by far the most interesting. And so in this poem, Dante famously describes 9 circles of hell, and each circle of hell had its own particular sin. So the top circle was for people who were not actually that bad. They had just committed the sin of not being a Christian, basically. But they were otherwise nice people, like Plato. Then you go down through increasingly bad circles, lust, gluttony, greed, right down to the bottom, 9th circle, which is treason, where Satan himself is found. You can see him just down at the bottom there. This was a very powerful way for Dante to not graphically, this illustration is a few hundred years later, but artistically represent the fact that there are many different sins, but some of them are worse than others. 700 years after this, I decided to update this for the scientific community with the 9 circles of scientific hell. This was a post I put up on my blog, I think it was 2010, and it was extremely popular, and it eventually was adapted as a paper in Perspectives in Psychological Science, which I think is the very first paper ever published under a blogging pseudonym. Not the first paper published under a pseudonym, but the first one that's been in a blogging pseudonym. So in this slightly less well drawn version of hell, I tried to provide a schema for the various different scientific sins. So again, it starts off with limbo, which is people who just sort of fail to act and make things better, but don't really make anything worse. And then down through things like overselling your results, making them sound more interesting than they are, post hoc storytelling, plagiarism, and finally inventing data or fabrication of data. So you can see that this is very much itself plagiarized from Dante. But I think that, again, the purpose of this was to show that to argue that these different problems are all sins in the sense that they are affecting science negatively. They're making results less replicable. They're making science less trustworthy in different ways, and some of them are worse than others. Clearly, no one's arguing that fabricating data is no worse than overselling your results to get a better grant. Fabricating data clearly is worse, but they are all on the road to damnation. But today I'm going to be talking about one particular sin, which is p-value phishing, the fourth circle, and this essentially all of the circles have ironic punishments essentially, and in this circle I imagine that people would have to fish for food, but only 1 in 20 of the fish would be edible, so they'd constantly be hungry. And p-value phishing is also called p-value hacking, which is how I'm going to refer to it today. That's now become a more common term. But it's a practice which has many different titles, and it's known as many different things, such as torturing the data until it will confess to anything, undisclosed flexibility of analysis, research to degrees of freedom in the analysis, questionable research practices, a slightly broader term, but p-hacking is the main one of those. Outcome reporting bias, particularly in the clinical literature. So you may have heard some or all of these terms, and I treat them more or less as interchangeable. And I'm going to use p-hacking as it's a nice, quick and punchy term. I'm going to use that term today. So, what exactly is p-hacking? What do I mean by it? I will come back to those later, sorry. So what exactly is p-hacking and what do I mean by it? So here's an example of how you might approach an analysis. You start off with your data and you run a series of analysis. So you've got 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Maybe it's pre-processing, processing, thresholding, or it could be any other series of analysis steps. You do this, and unfortunately, at the end, you end up with nothing. You don't get any significant results. So you decide to have another go, and you decide to rethink it. Not in the sense that you collect some more data, but you might decide to rerun some more analyses. So you try again, and this time it doesn't work. And this time you try a lot of others, and it doesn't work. But this time you get one which does work. You get a significant result, whatever it is that you're looking at, whatever that result means. It's part of the hypothesis that you're testing, and in using one series of analyses, one approach, you do get a significant result. This is perhaps an exaggerated scenario. You might not literally test dozens of other approaches until you get one that works, but on the other hand, maybe it's more realistic than we'd like to admit. Then what happens? Then you publish that one, and the others simply disappear. Or rather, they are never even there in the first place in the published literature. And this, I think, is the essential problem. So, as a scientist, if you're analyzing data and only publishing and selecting analyses on the basis that they provide positive results, then those results are not representative. Ideally, we should be given a set of data. We should decide what is the best way of analysing the data, and then stick to that. And then find out what it tells us, and then believe that. So if we think that the best method is X, we do X, and then if X comes out negative or positive, then we take that as the best estimate. Instead, we often decide what is the best method on the basis of which one gives us the result we want. Now, this I think is extremely common, but importantly and worryingly, it's very easy to do this without necessarily being conscious of it. And in fact, I think that it's very difficult not to do this to some extent if you're analyzing data, because it's very difficult. There's a huge temptation if you analyze your data and it doesn't quite come out. Let's say it comes out as a trend that it's not quite significant. You're going to go back and say, well, what's gone wrong? Maybe I've coded one of the subjects wrong, or I have used the wrong method. You find a textbook and say, well, maybe this method's better. Or you simply look at a different variable. And it's very difficult not to follow your curiosity, as that's often the only thing which is driving this. It's often driven not by a sort of sinister desire to mislead everyone, and or a cynical desire to bend the truth. It's often driven by genuine curiosity and a genuine desire to get the most out of the data. But this leads to unrepresentative results at the end. So p-hacking unfortunately does work, and this is, as I say, the reason it's so common, I think, is that it's very straightforward, and it's so easy that it can be done without really thinking. So, for example, again, we take some data. We can try many different statistical tests on the same data. So, let's say if we're doing correlation, we could do a Spearman's or a Pearson. If we're testing groups, we could do ANOVA, we could try different covariates. And none of these would necessarily be wrong. All of them would be justifiable in one sense. But every one is going to change the outcome, change the significance level of the result by some degree, because no two tests give exactly the same result. So you jitter the results essentially by using different tests. You can also try different variants of the same data. So I don't mean making up better data. I mean going back into your data and saying maybe there's some outliers, maybe there's some points here which have been miscoded or which have been which shouldn't be in this data set because they represent a subgroup. And this is the way essentially of jittering the data. Even if it only has quite a small effect, it still has an effect. And you can also look at different variables within the same data set. So in one of my own data sets, I have about 250 variables or columns and 100 rows. So there's 2.5 variables for every participant. Now, okay, admittedly, many of those are like name and age, and they're not perhaps things you can do stats on, but many of them are, and many of them are biological or behavioral outcome variables that I could, if I wanted to, mine and hack in an attempt to find a positive result. I think it's very common to want to collect as much data as possible, and in many ways that's a very good thing, but it does mean that there's often an enormous scope for hacking. And finally, as I say, you report the analyses that give the most favorable result, which is usually the lowest p-values, because that's the way to get papers published generally. Not always, though. You might want to get the p-values as high as possible. If, for instance, your theory is that there's no effect of something on the outcome, and then you're annoyed if you see that there is an effect. Or if you have a control group, a negative control group, you want to show no effect. But generally speaking, p-hacking acts to reduce p-values. When I say report the analyses, generally speaking, I mean here report in the sense of publish, but on a sort of more subjective level, there's a real tendency, I think, to only remember the results that are most significant, only remember the results that work, and then just forget all the other ones you tried. This is why it can be very, very easy to do this without realizing, because you save the output files when you get a result, you delete them when you finish your session if you don't find anything. Which is why it's very easy to go astray. And at the end of this talk, I'll be talking a little bit about ways in which we can prevent this from happening. But before that, I will show you just how easy and powerful p-hacking is. So this example is one I came up with this morning. So I went onto Wikipedia and I found the GDP, this is in millions of dollars per year, of the top 24 countries, from United States down to Argentina. This is our data set. We've got a grand total of 2 variables here. And let us suppose that I was a very strange individual, and my theory was that the length of the name of the country is correlated with the GDP. So countries with bigger or smaller names have more, are richer. So we can see whether that's the case by looking at the length of the name variable. And here we go. So we've got 13 here. UK is number 1, fantastic, with 14 characters in its name. So we then look at our correlations, and we've really got our fingers crossed here, and nothing happens. There's no correlation. Okay, well, that's annoying. But maybe it's not the end of the world. What if we look at the data in a scatter plot, which many people will tell you is always a very good idea to do, and it is a good idea to do, but it also makes it's also a good idea if you're trying to p-hack it. So let's say we put length here and GDP here, and we can see an outlier. So there's a huge outlier here, and this genuinely is an outlier. I mean, it is an outlier. So maybe there's a very good reason that we might want to get rid of it. But then if we get rid of it, we've tried 2 different analyses, and if we prefer one, then we're on the road to p-hacking. So the outlier is the USA, which has a huge GDP and also a high length. So we get rid of that and rerun the correlation. 0.187, p-value of 0.187, that's not too bad. But the data also is not normally distributed, as we can see here. So let's try Spearman's. Oh my god, we're now a trend, okay? If we decided to do this as a one-tailed test, we'd actually already have a significant result. A negative correlation between length and country GDP. But let's supposing that we're not willing to be that blatantly dodgy, and that we want to get a genuine, sensible 2-tailed result. So we can then look and we think, well, is there anything wrong with this data set? Hang on. Netherlands. But no one called it that. And it's called the Netherlands. And you see, this is just fixing a coding error. And again, justifiable. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable that you would do that. But again, you're trying it both ways. Now we see 0.83. No, but that's because I didn't do anything, because I didn't recalculate the length. So I'll try again. 0.074. So we're really getting close, but we're still not quite there. But now there's no real obvious outliers remaining. But hang on, United Kingdom, but no one calls it that. No one calls it that. We call it UK. It's not like we call Australia it's not like we call South Korea Republic of Korea. We use the shortest name. So we put Netherlands back, just to be fair, make it a fair test. We use the shortest name, which is in common use. Okay. Because we're not calling China People's Republic of China, are we? We just call it China. So we call UK UK. And then, will this be enough? Thank you. Yeah, he gave me the idea. And now, .006 and minus 555. Well, that's going to get on the front cover of PNAS. We call it.
You can put USA in back into USA.
Well, let's try it. But if it doesn't work, we'll pretend we didn't do that. Because, oh, hang on, I deleted the GDP. That data's lost forever, I'm afraid. And it'll be unethical to get that participant back in. So, so that's over, I'm afraid. But we've still got 23 people, and we've got a p-value of 0.06. 0.006. In other words, an exceptionally significant result, which can't possibly be due to chance. Now, but the thing is, it's not due to chance; it's due to selection. It's because we've tried many different things and selected them. So the p-value itself is actually perfectly accurate. It's just that we're interpreting that p-value in the wrong way if we say that that means that there really is a correlation. Bearing in mind that we've selected only the lowest p-values. Now, this approach that I've just done here obviously is sort of caricature of what would really happen, but hopefully I think it's not too bizarre because every step that I've done, as I say, is justifiable in a sense. There's nothing wrong with using UK rather than the United Kingdom. It's just that, and again, as I say, we didn't like just type in our own results. That would be fraud. We didn't do that. We simply made a series of choices, each of which was justifiable, and we ended up with a incredibly significant result. And in that case, there were only two variables. If there had been 100 variables, it would have been 100 times easier. Of course, no one in real life would, I hope, hypothesize that and actually do that. But this is, again, is the danger of p-hacking is that people tend to only try to find results that confirm their hypotheses, and their hypotheses tend to seem plausible. That's why they became hypotheses in the first place. So this tends to not produce ridiculous results, but seemingly plausible results. How many degrees of freedom are there in an average data set? There have been remarkably few studies looking at this, and in fact, I think it's probably infinite. I mean, if you have a large data set, you can probably do effectively infinite numbers of analyses on it. Joshua Karp in 2012 had a very interesting paper in Frontiers of Neuroscience, in which he took a data set of fMRI with a very simple task. I think it was a block design, very simple language task, and he analyzed it in 7,000 different ways by changing the parameters like smoothness, thresholding, and the statistical package used. And this showed an exceptionally great variety of results. Each of these dots is like one permutation of this, and that's the peak of all the activity blobs in the brain in that particular case. So what this shows is that if you choose your parameters correctly, you could get a peak almost anywhere. I mean, they do cluster around the areas you'd expect, like the language cortex. However, if you choose your parameters correctly, you can still get them anywhere else, which is rather worrying. But even Joshua Karp only used a tiny fraction of the possible analyses, because he could also have looked at connectivity, which he didn't, or he could have looked at multivariate, like pattern classification. Again, so there's many things he didn't even do. So that 7,000 is a great underestimate. So supposing you are p-hacking, how can you do this in a way that you don't get caught? Well, so in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of concern about p-hacking, and a number of researchers have come along and devised tools for detecting p-hacking. One of these, which is which has become quite somewhat controversial, is the p-curve, in which you plot. So essentially, I mean, the reason it's controversial is that you can use it like as a kind of sniper rifle. You sort of target a particular researcher, and you say, in all their papers, let's plot the p-values in all their published papers. And you look at the ones that are below 0.05, and if there's a sort of bump just below 0.05, and the blue line going up here, that's evidence that they've been p-hacking, that they've got results that they're sort of just nudging down below the threshold. So this bump below 0.05 can be used on the level of a meta-analysis or a researcher's whole career or a whole field. So it's rather, it's caused quite a lot of acrimony, although not as acrimonious as the approach which essentially says take a researcher's whole career and calculate the power they had to detect the effects that they were reporting, and then if their power to detect the effects they were reporting is quite low, then they must have been not publishing negative results. Which actually, I think when it boils down to it, is essentially a variant of the p-curve. So this has been rather controversial, but it does seem to reveal large numbers of fields and literatures which are full of suspiciously many p-values just below the threshold. Although a weakness of this is it assumes that we stop as soon as we find a result of 0.05, but I think that in many cases we always prefer an even lower p-value. So in this case, that I just did earlier, we hacked our way to a value of 0.006. We wouldn't then bother to hack something else, we just publish that. So we wouldn't publish anything which was 0.04. So how can this be prevented? So I've given a bit of a sort of doom-filled lecture so far, but there are, I think, ways in which we can reform science and make this less likely. In this slide, we've got on the left we've got the current system, which is you do your study, then you write it up, then you send it to peer review, which is the rainbow flag, and then you send it off to publication. And then, sorry, if it's accepted, then it becomes published. And this model, you send all parts of the paper, introduction, methods, result, and conclusions to peer review, which means that the peer reviewer only gets a finished product. Now, it has been proposed that a better way around this would be to use something called two-step review, in which you send the peer reviewer essentially half the paper, only the introduction and the methods. And then the reviewer has to review that, and if they think that the introduction and the methods are sound, then basically the paper gets published. There's like a secondary review of the results and conclusions, but that's much less, that's just to make sure that they're sort of basic sanity check. The idea here is the reviewer, because they're not reviewing the results, won't be swayed by whether or not the results are positive or negative, and won't be swayed by whether they agree or disagree with the reviewer's own views. So this was proposed 2 years ago, but I think an even better approach is what's called peer pre-review or pre-registration. In this approach, rather than the researcher doing the study, then writing the paper, and then sending half of it off to the reviewers, the researcher writes the introduction and methods, essentially, of a paper before having actually done the study itself. They then send that protocol or proposal off for peer review at a journal. If it's accepted, then the journal commits to publishing the paper, pretty much whatever the results are, again, with a basic sanity check to make sure that the researchers did in fact do the study. But essentially, whatever the results are, the journal is committing to publish it. Now, under this system, not only does the reviewer not get to censor or disparage negative results. But the researchers themselves have written their protocol, and that's now a matter of record. It's not published, but it will be published, and it's held by the journal. So they then need to follow that protocol, and the protocol should be sufficiently detailed that it includes an analysis plan. So essentially this prevents, or is designed to prevent, and I think will prevent, p-hacking. This system doesn't stop researchers from using lots of different methods, but there's a given primary method which they designed, and then they have to use that as their primary method. They can of course then use secondary analyses or do all of the kinds of analysis they want, but that'll be clearly unambiguously marked as being a secondary rather than the primary analysis, allowing the readers to decide whether or not they think the secondary analysis is p-hacked or genuinely interesting. So this is called, as I say, peer pre-review or pre-registration, and this was pioneered as an institution by the journal Cerebral Cortex and its editor Chris Chambers. And this registered reports, as they're called at Cortex, there's now been I forget what the count is now, but there's I think at least another 8 or 10 journals have now introduced or are planning to introduce the same system, and it's worth looking into. There are lots of there's a big debate over this, and a lot of people are concerned that it will make it more difficult to do science, that it will make it more bureaucratic, that it will make it more less creative. But on the other hand, there are an equal number of people who are saying that it needn't do that. That it's perfectly compatible with creativity. It just requires us to rethink how we do science, and it certainly is a bit of a sort of cultural shift. But so it's very much in the early stages, and I would recommend that science move towards that and certainly explore that much further. This, incidentally, is the cover of Cortex there. This is a great cartoon in which a researcher has a fishing rod. It's a bit too small, but he's fishing p-values out of his monitor, and he's sort of straining against it, trying to pull a p out of the screen, while meanwhile his file drawer is exploding with unpublished results. I couldn't find a bigger image of it, unfortunately. So I'll just conclude with some shamelessly copied slides from Joe Simmons and Ori Simonson of Pennsylvania, who have done a lot of work on this, and they had a talk a couple of years ago at the Society for Personality and Social Psychology called Life After P-Hacking, and they start off with a bold statement that we have decided not to p-hack. What does this mean for us as individuals? And they then go on to discuss how this will practically affect what it would mean and how scientists would need to adapt to this. So, for instance, they say p-hacking means that power has not been a major concern, because if you have an underpowered study, you can still get a result by p-hacking. But if you're not allowed to do that, or if you make a personal decision not to do that, then power becomes much more important. It means that we'll need to think much more about how to get a sample size with a high enough power. Later on, they say that a sample size of at least 50 should be the absolute minimum. But I think that will depend on the branch of psychology or neuroscience we're talking about. But certainly, power becomes much more important. And it's a very good talk, actually. It's all online, called Life After P-Hacking. So that's the end of my guide to p-hacking, and I hope that you're going to go away and p-hack less as a result of this, not more. But if you are hacking more, then at least you'll know what you're doing, and you won't be doing it unconsciously.